皆様、続いてのテーマはアジアのエコシステムと規制 with Bloomberg. I'd now like to introduce our panelists. First of all is Katherine Dowling, Bitwise Asset Management and Executive Management General Counsel and CCO. We also have Emily Parker. She's with the Global Blockchain Business Council China and the Japan Advisor. Next, we have Hiroshi Ozaki, KPMG AZSA LLC Executive Advisor, and Ju Chunko, legislator from Taiwan. And our moderator today is Sherry An, Bloomberg News anchor. So, are you guys ready? Please come up to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon. It's really great to be here. It's a very exciting day. And I gotta say, regulatory landscape, not necessarily the most exciting topic, but I'm really glad that you're here. We're gonna try to make it fun. I've just arrived in Japan about 3 months ago. Bloomberg TV has launched a new show from Tokyo, and I gotta say, I was very interesting to see how advanced the regulatory framework was for Japan for Web3, which I believe coming from New York, I wasn't very aware of. So I would like to start there. Can I start with you, Emily, to set the scene of how unique Japan's development has been?
Sure, and I think that's an absolutely true observation. I think a lot of people are surprised at how sophisticated Japan is with digital asset regulation. I'd say Japan is leading the world in a few key areas. The first one is in stablecoin regulation. So a lot of people outside of the Japan, Asia crypto world don't realize that Japan is probably the first major economy to have nationwide stablecoin regulation. US is very far from that. So, that's just one example. Japan was a very early first mover in crypto by kind of, making rules around Bitcoin as a form of payment, had early exchanges. It suffered some very severe hacks. But there's a lot of innovation happening here in Japan. For example, there's a few politicians in the Liberal Democratic Party who are very pro-crypto. The other thing that's interesting about Japan is that in a lot of other Asian jurisdictions, there's a little bit of a separation between crypto and blockchain. Like we like blockchain, but we don't like crypto. I would put Singapore maybe in that category. They like tokenized assets, but really are not super into crypto. Japan is actually supportive of crypto specifically, so that's very different. And just, there's a lot of very detailed guidelines around NFTs, for example. Japan has put some rules around DAOs, which is really interesting and really unique. For example, a DAO can register as an LLC. I don't know any other country that's doing that. It's possible in the United States and Wyoming, I think, but not at a national level. So I think the takeaway here is that Japan has very sophisticated, very comprehensive regulation, but it's also very, very strict. So I think that's just a really important footnote. Like, just because Japan is like crypto friendly does not mean at all that it's easy to do business here.
No, I mean, Emily, you mentioned some of those big cases and instances of hacking. Of course, we have Mt. Gox in 2014 that has led to that regulatory landscape and authorities becoming very serious about this, right? Hiroshi, tell us a little bit, because you were specifically in this sector for a very long time trying to gauge sort of the risks and the threats that emanate from here. Tell us about how authorities have taken that and how that's really led to the development of this environment in Japan.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you very much for your comment, Emily. So So I was in the FSA, and I was the MLCFT Policy Office Director, and also a Chief Inspector for MLCFT. So that's why I'm always looking at the dark side. So not a rosy story. So, but the balancing is very important. So yeah, thank you very much. So Emily, your description is, I agree with you, and I appreciate your comment.
Hiroshi's going to be the devil's advocate
yes,
here, right?
Advocate, yes. So my nickname was, terrorist at the FSA. But anyway, so there is a good side. Thank you very much. And but also dark side is the misuse by the bad guys for money laundering. That's the very serious, issues. Not now in Japan, but not only in Japan, but in APAC and Europe, in the United States. So that's the, we have to know these risks and threats as well. So then we can go forward together to foster the market and enjoy the benefit of the technology. That's my comment.
So, JC, tell us a little bit about how Taiwan is doing this, because as Hiroshi put it, the terrorist in this risk and threat assessment, you also have the benefits. How do you foster that?
Yeah, Taiwan is just like an outlier in the business, and also just like a geek or a nerd in the business. Back to 2013-14, we have a lot of developers jump into the Bitcoin development. And after that, in 2016, we have a lot of developers jump into the Ethereum network. So in Taiwan, the situation is the developer, the startup, the community is going really fast. And however, our government is trying to catch up. Recently, our government and startup and our business have a consensus that maybe, like in blockchain, we say, don't trust, just verify. So in Taiwan, they have a consensus to do the self-regulation. So which is a new way, kind of like a new model in Asia, to have a lot of startup, a lot of exchange to do the self-regulation and cooperate with our government, the Financial Supervisory Commission, and to follow up and to comply with the AML. So with this type of self-regulation, which create a great and large space for startup. So Taiwan is kind of like a shining star, very energetic. However, in the following steps, we might have a specific law to learn from Japan, learn from the other place, and maybe we will go in after that. Yeah.
I want to get to all of the details of how you could get there, but Katherine, let me go to you, because we have talked about some of the pitfalls, we have talked about the skepticism, and the US was no different, and yet you managed to overcome that, and you actually launched spot Bitcoin ETFs, spot Ether ETFs.
Yes, thanks, Sherry. And there's been a big flavor in the US that we've been really behind the curve. After being ahead of the curve on internet, et cetera, really not doing enough around crypto. And I think part of it was that our regulator, there was a thought previously that if there was to be regulation, it would really be an acknowledgement. And I think for many years, the flavor was, well, we're not going to touch it because if we try to regulate it or show that we're trying to regulate it, we're actually giving it more credibility than we want to give. And I would argue that ignoring behavior early on actually created a lot of the difficulties that we've seen. And it could have been prevented had the regulators gotten in earlier, thought about it, created sandboxes, and really allowed for some of these businesses to develop in a more nurturing environment, right? So now what we have is a lot of reactivity. What you hear, the regulation by enforcement, which as a former prosecutor myself, I was a prosecutor for a decade in the U.S. Attorney's Office, I don't find that particularly helpful, and I think many folks in the ecosystem don't either. Look, it has to happen. You have to have enforcement. That is a must-have. But if that's the way you're trying to back into how businesses should operate, you're going to have so much gray area. You just are. It's the reality. Because when you get enforcement actions, they're so specific to the cases that are before them that if you're another business looking from the outside in, it's really hard to look at that as a roadmap for choices you should make fundamentally about how your business should choose to operate. And the vast majority of these businesses are valid and trying to do the right thing. And if you don't give them that clear path, or at least a dialogue about how to get there, you're really doing a disservice to those businesses. And that's been what's been going on in the US for a long stretch. Despite that, we did get the spot Bitcoin ETF out. Bitwise was one of the issuers, and spot ETH ETF out. So 24 has been a big year, and it's going to be an even bigger one. We can talk about the political winds that are floating around because it's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be an interesting conversation too, but Emily, you wanted to say something perhaps on Japan as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. And as someone who splits my time between Japan and the United States, I can really see the comparison here. And I totally agree with this idea, of regulation by enforcement in the U.S. I mean, for example, and this is another place where Japan is very different. You might not like the rules in Japan. Some people don't, but at least you know what they are. In the U.S., people are still arguing about what is a security and what is a commodity, who regulates what. There's a network of different states have different rules, and I think maybe from a distance it's oh, that's cool. So with the U.S. you can do whatever you want, but that's so not true, because what happens is, again, regulation by enforcement. Then you have these lawsuits, and if you look at the SEC website, it's just lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And for some of the big companies, like Coinbase or Ripple, they might have the treasury to deal with these kind of lawsuits. But for smaller companies, I mean, just living under the threat of something like that, right. And it depends on who you ask, obviously. But according to some people in the crypto industry, it's they don't even know when such a lawsuit would happen or why. And so yeah, it would definitely be better, I think, to have some more clarity at the outset.
Yeah, the compliance overhead, sort of, right, Hiroshi?
Yes. Thank you. So, Jesse, you said that Taiwan is a shining star. Yes, that's true. And I think Emily for describing the situation. So I agree with you. And Kathleen, so we are on the same side. Used to be. Okay. So, but
we work with KPMG extensively, yes. Actually.
So, but the point is, each jurisdiction has the different style of the regulation and the supervision, right? But most important thing is the dialogue between the private and public sector, especially for this kind of a new technology. So maybe regulator doesn't know in detail what's going on in the market, but they have to listen to the voice of the private sector and learn from the private sector, and the dialogue is very, very key. And part of also think this is important to listen to the voice of the public sector. I think that's very important for every jurisdiction.
I mean, given that this changes so fast, right? I mean, keeping up with technology, regulation, trying to keep up with that. How is Taiwan doing it? And earlier you also said that there were some things that you could learn as well.
Yeah, Taiwan, just like I said, that we produce a lot of semiconductor chips, IC design. We are kind of like a nerdy place in the world. And it's similar in the digital space. So in cryptocurrency, a lot of startups, they're running really fast. And for legislator, originally, there are not so many people understand this, and also public sector. They are really worried about that, and there are a lot of scam and fraud. So they think the technology is quite dangerous. However, recently in these few years, start to have some nerdy guy in the parliament. So we have a really, really, in a good way, we have a dialogue with a lot of startups, and then they already from up a VASP guild in Taiwan. And we regularly have a dialogue from Parliament with VASP, VASP with FSC, and also for the public sector. And all the time, many people, they're eagerly they want to have like a specific law for cryptocurrency. However, we are talking about this, we have to maybe patiently wait for timing, because we need knowledge for the public sector. They have to have the education themselves, and also we have to have a budget for them to purchase some tools to analyze the on-chain data, something like that. So we are on the way, and I think it's the situation right now is really great and nice in Taiwan.
Just FYI, you keep calling it nerdy people like us, but we're all here because we're nerds and we love this technology, don't we? But Katherine, you were talking about the political winds. Maybe have they changed a little bit? I mean, it was interesting was it a couple of weeks ago where former President Trump was talking about talking up basically NFTs, making his own sales pitch, wanting to make Bitcoin great again, was I think in one of his hats. I mean, are things changing in the United States?
Yeah, it was really interesting because in January, after we launched Spot Bitcoin ETF, we thought it was actually going to be a really long stretch before we were able to get ETH out the door. And to JC's point, we have a lot of dialogue with the SEC, actually. Even though the leadership of the SEC is somewhat anti-crypto, it seems, we speak with them regularly about what we're looking at down the pike, because they're trying to prioritize what they're going to look at and what they're working on, because crypto turns out is not the only thing that they do day in, day out, even though we eat and breathe it, right? So when we heard nothing about the filing, the ETH spot filing, we assumed that we were going to have to definitionally get an answer on whether ETH was going to be considered a security or not in the United States. And when we talk to the regulators, we're looking at what other nations are doing and saying, and pointing to them, and also saying, look, there are ETFs in other countries. Here's how they're doing. And you can take it out of the academics and say, look, they're functioning, they're working. So it's super helpful when we all work together in different nations about how we're developing the rules of the road. But then with Spot ETH, really out of the blue, we started getting the approvals or the win that what's called a 19B4, the listing exchange filing, that we were going to get approval. And that was because of the change in the politics, because Trump started coming out being pro-crypto, and crypto has now become an issue in this political race.
Do you think that could change depending on who wins in November?
So I think most would agree that if it's a Trump administration, there are going to be some quick changes to the leadership of the SEC, and we'll probably see...
He said he would fire Gary Gensler, didn't he?
Yes, he's been very clear about that happening. Toppling, I think, was the word at one point. But so that will change more quickly. I think with Kamala Harris that she comes from California, so she's got technology in her veins. I think it's going to be better than would be a Biden administration. I think the Biden administration has been incredibly reliant on Gary Gensler, and that's been their voice box, and they have not wanted to change course or deviate from that. So it's been Senator Warren, Biden, Gensler. So I do think that with Kamala Harris, it won't be as quick and forward motion as it would with the Trump administration, but I think it would be a better, more crypto-friendly administration.
Emily, I know you want to add to those comments, but also I'm curious about something that we talked off stage about some of the hurdles around the environment here in Japan as well. I know you've not been happy with the tax system too.
Yes, well, I can just speak about some of the things I've heard about unhappiness about the tax system, since I'm not a Japanese taxpayer. But so yes, I will defer to you on tax. But yes, I think there's, one interesting point here is that despite all the criticism of the U.S. and the regulatory environment, the fact that U.S. has these ETFs is notable, because I don't think we're going to see one in Japan very soon. Maybe sometime, but that's generally been the vibe here, that the FSA is not super into ETFs, partly because I think, going back to what you said earlier, this idea that an ETF would be seen as kind of like a stamp of approval of crypto a little bit, that I don't think they're totally ready to make. So that's just an interesting distinction. But yeah, the taxes, so, I think one of the interesting things about Japan is that there's so much excitement in Japan about the kind of the regulatory clarity and just the pro Web3 statements from the government, but there's a little bit of a disconnect between that and kind of the amount of like startup activity you see here in the blockchain world. And I think, I've been kind of trying to understand like why there's that disconnect, because I would think like this would be an amazing place to come and build a startup, and it should be attracting more crypto talent from all over the world. And I think when you really dig into it, if you have to just kind of pinpoint one obstacle, it's probably taxes. And because so basically in Japan, crypto can be taxed at the highest rate of 55%. That's not all the rate for everybody, but that's the highest rate. And when you think about that, if you look at that in a regional perspective, if you compare that to Hong Kong or Singapore, that makes Japan pretty uncompetitive. And not only is the tax rate high, and again, you're obviously more expert in this, but it's complicated. That's the other complaint. It's that it's a high tax rate, and it's like it's very complicated and very laborious to file tax returns on crypto here. So I think that's been a bit of a problem.
Hiroshi, I know you want to say something.
So I'm not working for the government now, but I used to work for the government for almost 9 years in Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and FSA. So I'd like to withdraw my comment on the tax rate about it, but
no, wait, I know that you talked about
but,
taxing more recovered gains from illicit activities.
Yes. So, no comment, please.
But let's talk to JC a little bit about what's happening in Taiwan as well, because it also, we're talking about the tax system as one of those hurdles and about government involvement, right? But at the same time, how do you foster that startup innovation environment?
Yeah, recently, because thank you for WebEx and thank you for the stage to inviting me here. I'm here to learn and also finding some opportunity for Taiwan to working closer with Japan and the other place. Taiwan, we have a lot of startup developers, nerds, and geeks. And however, the capitals and the government seems a little bit more conservative. And Japan is really proactively on the investment and for capital, and also have a really great experience on the regulation. So I believe combined with the energetic startup and well-regulation in Japan and capital, and also the huge opportunity in the other place all over the world, I believe Taiwan could be a place. And also, we are kind of like friendly on taxation compared with Japan. Maybe just a little difference. Japan here is 23, Taiwan is like around 20. However, I believe the talent and startup in Taiwan could help. So I think more dialogue like this would be helpful.
Hiroshi, I know that you wanted to skip the tax question, but let's talk a little bit about the other reasons the government needs to get involved, right? Because we are seeing, of course, the risks. We talked about fraud being one of them. I know that we talked about the regulatory framework for stablecoin, but at the same time, the latest report from the Financial Action Task Force standards also showing that you're having more adoption and use of stablecoins for fraud and illicit activities. What's a good balance here?
Thank you very much for changing the course of the discussion.
You're not off the hook completely.
Yes. Yeah, but open discussion is very always welcome. But I was talkative behind the scene. But anyway, so because the government have to involve it, because there is a risk and threat to be regulated. And let's say, so Star Wars. So Duke Skywalker became a Darth Vader. So he used to be a Jedi, but suddenly changed his mind to go to a dark side. So everything has the bright side and dark side, and we have to watch the, this is a normal account when opening or get on board, opening an account, but it's become to a bad guy's mirror account because he or she sell the account to a bad guy. It could happen. So that's realistic, and that's going on in the real world. And also, the Bitcoins and some kind of crypto assets are involved and used for the bad guys for money laundering. So that's why the government have to work together on the platform of the FATF to make the regulation on the global standard. So like travel rules implementation, that's the a very good story of the why the government have to get involved. So that's the one side. And this kind of the balance, yes, balance is very important. So too much regulation kills the innovation or bring the unintended consequences. So that's thinking about that risk as well, and taking a balance of the risk, threats, and the innovation. That's the key. But it is not so easy. Easier said than done, kind of issue. That's why we have to talk a lot and give a dialogue together, and maybe even though among the jurisdictions as well. Yeah.
That's my next question. Sort of regulatory convergence on the global stage, right? Because I mean, we're talking about technology that has no borders. If we're talking about different things happening in the United States and different things happening in Japan, when does this start becoming a problem?
I like that one. I take that.
Okay.
Yeah, because the bad guys use the loopholes, weakness, to get into or penetrate into the financial system. It's a first step of the money laundering. It's a placement and integration. And then the bad guys will get the gain to reproduce another crime. So that's why we have to work together to fill in the gap of the regulation and fill in the loopholes. That's very important for, make the world a better place.
When it comes to the private sector, Katherine, are those some things under consideration, or are you looking just within the jurisdiction in order to be able to launch these products and get it going?
No, 100% looking globally. And it's actually part of the bigger conversation when I go meet with members of Congress, especially on the Republican side. The concern is if we in the United States don't take some ownership on the shores, market structure legislation specifically, we're going to push this business offshores, and we may push it to areas of the world where we won't have that collaboration. And it's so key. Take crypto out of it for a moment. Even with cash, as a former federal prosecutor, if I had a person that we had indicted who absconds outside of the US, it is so hard, depending on where they go, to track the cash, to get them back, et cetera. So cash is still king, right? But if there's money to be made, you're going to find the folks on the other side who are going to try to find it. I used to work in a building that had some brass pipes and copper pipes, and people would scale the building to go get it, right? So the point being, we do have to think of it. It is a global asset, and we do have to think about creating that collaboration so that when you do have your proverbial bad guys, because they're going to come if there's money to be made, you have a better way of tracking them down and working together to go after them. But the more you push it into areas that don't have regulations, like Japan is a model of some of the regulations here, which is great, we see how those work. And then we work together, right? We learn from each other. But the more we push it where there is less regulation and less collaboration with other countries, that makes it much more difficult.
Emily, we've talked about how uniquely advanced Japan is on the regulatory framework. Is that a domestic sort of infrastructure? Is that something that can lead the international conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it should be more than it probably is. I mean, if you look at, for example, stablecoin regulations are just such a case in point because there's so many other places trying to do that. Hong Kong has a sandbox right now. The U.S. has all these bills, but we haven't really passed anything into law. So I think, there's a few specific areas where I think people could look toward Japan and see, or just the fact that, Japan has a lot of clarity about what is a security and what isn't, which, the U.S. The definition of a security is a lot simpler. It's a lot more focused. So there's a few areas where I think, Japan could definitely, we could take sort of specific examples of what Japan is doing and apply to other places.
Is it concerning that we're going to see a leadership election from the ruling LDP? Is that going to bring some uncertainty? Are things going to change? Is that something that the industry thinks about?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't say I've heard any real alarm. If anything, I've heard people say well, this could be good, depending on who it is. I think it's people don't know who it's going to be. crazy. So,
Right.
but I haven't heard anybody express like strong concern about it. And I think the Web3 project team, which has been very active at this event, there's like a handful of politicians who are really supportive of crypto. Like, I don't think that's necessarily going to change just because there's a new prime minister. It could, obviously, but I think that, and then obviously there's the FSA, there's people within the FSA who are being, quite innovative. So I haven't heard a sense of alarm about that.
Yeah, because it's been interesting how really Prime Minister Kishida has called Web3 as part of the new form of capitalism, right? I do wonder, does Taiwan have some sort of consensus when it comes to looking at Web3, looking at all of these new technologies?
Yeah, I believe that in Taiwan, people are a little bit concerned because there are a lot of scam and fraud. However, because we really pay attention on AI, which is kind of a lot of working force will be in the virtual world, then we will have a digital economy to do the transaction of the working result from AI, from robotics, from humanoid. So I believe digital economy will be a network for the future economy. So in Taiwan, originally, government are a little bit conservative. Our general public is a little bit worried. However, recently everything's changed. And I believe in Taiwan, we will embrace the technology more and more, and we will have a better framework. For example, like Taiwan is a technology first place, and then regulation coming after. So Taiwan is really great on the cybersecurity, the technology framework. We can work with others, and then we can learn from others from the regulation part. So that's the cooperation that we can make here. Yeah.
In the meantime, how do you protect citizens? Because as you said, fraud is an issue, and educating them.
Yes. Education will be the key. And recently, our government is fully aware about that because as a legislator, we remind and work with the government. So education will be the key. And also, we have a Minister of Digital Affairs. They are creating a lot of kind of like a Web3 type of project, for example, like digital identity, DID, or like a digital wallet. So I believe Taiwan, we're doing great before, and then we will doing better after that because government is trying to embrace on technology and also on regulation. So recently we're start to talk about stable coin. So I learned a lot from here, like Japan or the other government. So on legislation part, we will catch up. And however, at the same time, our technology will be able to help the others. So it will be an ally. And then to protect general public by ourselves, by education, but at the same time, we can have an ally to connect with the other place like Japan and the other tech company to create a better kind of information exchange network to protect our users.
Hiroshi?
Yes, Sherry, that's a very good point about the why or how the protect the consumer, the customer. That's very important. That's why the government have to intervene, so to strengthen the consumer protection and IT securities as well. So that's very important, yes. So that's the reason why the government have to involve.
What are some of the mitigation measures that you've implemented?
And the supervision of the regulated BASPs to, fill in the requirement of the customer protection, consumer protection, and IT security. The animal spirit is very great, but not only the animal spirits, but also the regulation is required, needed for the customers and consumers.
And it's not just about outright fraud that's the issue, right? I mean, when it came to spot Bitcoin ETFs or spot Ether ETFs, Katherine, it was also about just the concern that the normal investor would not understand or would not be immune to the incredible volatility in these assets. How do you get around that?
Well, we don't get around it. And that's the beauty of the spot Bitcoin ETF, because it's in a regulated wrapper. So the investor actually receives all of the documentation around that, disclosure documents around it, which explains the product. So they're in a much better scenario from an information standpoint to look at that product and make their choice to invest in it rather than, say, a meme coin, right? So it actually creates a better environment. From my point earlier, had we started this process earlier, I mean, it took 6 years to get spot Bitcoin ETF. In the interim, some of those investors that wanted to get diversification could have done so through these products on the shores of the US rather than on offshore FTX, for instance, right? So when you push those businesses offshore, you create those vacuums and you create those scenarios. So we are actively trying not to get around that. We want to put the information, we want to tell the investor, this is volatile. This may not be for you. You could lose all your money. I mean, those are quotes, right? So they need to decide how much of their wallet they want to place in that, and it should be a very small percentage. And when it's placed in a brokerage account, which is opened up by the spot Bitcoin ETF, it then can fall under the purview of your financial advisor, who can then provide you more information. They think this is not for you, or this percentage is for you, not a huge percentage. So it just creates more education around it. It doesn't change the fact that it's still a volatile asset, but it creates that wrapper and makes it a better environment for an individual to make an informed decision. But it's all about the balance too, right? You have to have the balance in the regulation to create that information for the investor, but also on the flip side to avoid your money laundering issues as well, right? So you have to have the KYC side, right? And you have some projects that actively want to avoid that, and unfortunately, in order to create what we need in a scalable environment, there's going to have to be some giving up of that, I don't want to tell you who's investing, right? But so you have those forces that are conflicting in some projects within crypto.
Emily, is there that understanding here in Japan? Did I hear you correctly when you said earlier that you don't see that sort of ETFs happening here in this country?
Maybe not, I wouldn't say never, but I think the short-term indication is that there's not going to be one super quickly. So, yeah.
Is that because of the concerns surrounding it?
I think that probably, if I had to guess, I think that, again, Japan is very supportive of crypto, but I think the level of like mainstream adoption that an ETF represents, I think there's probably some concern among regulators that by allowing an ETF, it's kind of a tacit admission that, it's okay for the average household to invest in Bitcoin and Ethereum, and I don't think they're quite there yet. That would be my guess.
I mean, we have seen this sort of more adoption into mainstream given these ETFs as well, but how much of a sense is there that we're seeing this convergence between traditional finance and these new technologies?
Well, one thing I want to add, it's not exactly traditional finance, but I do think there's a very interesting data point that just happened very recently, because we've been talking a lot about the government, but I do think this Sony blockchain is really worth mentioning. It's really early. We don't know how it's going to go, but I think there's something very notable. As far as I know, there is no company of that size that is doing a permissionless blockchain. That's what's interesting about it. It's not an enterprise blockchain. It's on Ethereum. So and the fact that it's coming from Japan and coming from Sony is obviously a very global company, but it is coming from here. It's coming from Sony headquarters, and I think they are reacting to some degree to the signals that they've been getting from the LDP and just from the regulatory environment. So I think that's a really interesting data point that just came out, I think, over the past week or so.
I was going to ask, is that sort of what's different with Japan as well? Because outside of Japan, especially in the US, you see this startup environment, these small players trying to make the biggest noise.
Yeah.
And here in Japan, you have the big players like Sony. We have SBI Holdings also being a very active player in the industry.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Sony thing, again, like very early, but it seems kind of next level to me. Like, just because it's a permissionless blockchain, that's just really, really unusual. And yeah, I mean, we haven't seen that kind of thing from like a US company of that size or of that, so that's a pretty uniquely Japanese thing that's happening right now, so.
Hiroshi, do you have any thoughts? Does that make Japan very unique? And is it better for the regulatory environment when you have these big players with bigger stakes, or is it not? Does it hamper innovation?
I think both. So big players and also so many startups now. So like everybody here today and yesterday. So this kind of the combination is good. So leading and taking a risk by the big guys, and then the startup will seek for the opportunity in a niche and getting bigger. So that's kind of things is going on in the US and Asia Pacific as well. So it's not just a Japan style, but I think that's the very not extraordinary way of the things is going on this kind of a new technology and startups and angel investors. So in the United States have so many angel investors, but in Japan the big players is doing the same kind of roles. So that's my observation.
JC, do you have that sort of money also going into the industry in Taiwan?
Yeah, the strategy is here. Just like I said, the Taiwan market or like developer community is really energetic. And might because of that we have a self-regulation strategy from the government. So maybe Japan, like SBI, they can invest startup in Taiwan doing Web3. And then our startup can work with Sony and with a large company in Japan or the other place. So I believe the combination will be better for a single place and work by themselves. So I believe that's also one of the proof of tech has no border, right?
Oh, yeah.
And especially for Web3. Yeah.
Before we wrap up the conversation, I just want to throw one same question for everyone. What will be the next big thing that you'll be watching in this space that you should tell everybody here in the audience to watch out for? Who wants to go first?
At the risk of sounding America-centric, I would say the U.S. election because I mean, just because the U.S. has been, their take on crypto has been so controversial, and I think we're going to see a change no matter who wins. And so, yeah, I think that's something that I mean, even as I pay attention to Asia, it's a very big story.
Katherine, you too?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think, with the SEC, it has to be a security for them. There's other ways, but really, it's hammer nail, right? It's got to be a security to go after it. And what we're seeing right now is some hyper-jurisdictional grabs, and we've been seeing that trend for a while. There have been some very positive pushbacks on that, the Grayscale lawsuit that actually opened up the door to allow for the spot launch. And then you've also seen the Ripple litigation that has, it's gone both ways, but I think generally has veered towards positive. And to like Emily's point earlier about smaller projects that don't have the bank to defend themselves. That leads to settlements, and that's not helpful because the SEC chalks that up as a win. 90+% of the cases settle with the SEC. I used to work very actively with the SEC, right? So I think we do need to get at those definitions, and they're really key, right? Yesterday, we had a Wells notice against OpenSea. For Web3, that's a terrible development. It's a terrible development. You're going to call every NFT a security? That's just, it's not possible, and it also opens the door to pushing those young businesses away, right? Like it doesn't make sense, and we need to rein that in. And thankfully in Congress, you're seeing actually a lot of bipartisan support because they're seeing this land grab by the SEC, and they're seeing the different situations where you have federal courts saying, no, you can't do that, right? Which is good, right? So that's all positive, but it's a slow-moving ship. So in terms of what we see, I think, yes, the political election will be a big positive because that is going to remove the Genslerian era from the U.S., and that will be a helpful development.
Hiroshi, next big thing?
My expertise is the anti-money laundering and the anti-financial crime and the anti-fraud. So whoever the president of the United States is going to be after the November election, or whoever the prime minister of Japan going to be, so it's never changed. The first priority, one of the highest priority of the year, is anti-money laundering and anti-financial crime, and also the national security, because the DPRK is deeply involved on the illicit use of the crypto assets as well.
North Korea.
And it's a rough neighbor here. So this kind of things never change. So the importance of the agenda of the MLCFT or anti-financial crime and the anti-fraud is never changed. So that's my observation.
JC?
Yes, I just want everyone to remember the plurality of Web3. The Web3 is not only for blockchain. It's for the world, it's being digitalization, and it's a movement. And everything will be online, on web. Like, for example, we will have AI agent, we will have robot, we will have IoT already, and then a lot of stuff will happen online, and then we will have to have an economy solution for digital space. And then blockchain and Web3 crypto will be the perfect solution. So everything will combine. So that's, I believe, the WebX will be the final solution for Web3.
Right.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you also for being part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. That was amazing and very interesting. We'd like to take a photograph with everyone, please. So could you please get in the center and take a photograph? これから記念写真を撮っていただきたいと思います。Right in the center. And if you wait on the side of the stage, they would like to give you that photograph as well. Thank you so much. もう一度盛大な拍手をお送りください. Please give them another big round of applause for that very interesting and informative session. はい、続いてのセッションは今しばらくお待ちください. We'll start our next session in just a few moments.